The camp of Israel was unusually quiet that night. No music, no laughter, only the low whisper of the wind moving through the tents. Across the valley stood a giant no one dared to face. For 40 days, the armies of Israel had watched him step forward, towering above the battlefield like a living mountain. Every morning and every evening, the giant roared his challenge. And every time, the soldiers stepped back. His name was Goliath, a warrior so massive, so terrifying, that even the bravest men of Israel would not move. Armor clanged nervously. Shields trembled in the hands of trained fighters. Even the mighty king's army had fallen silent under the weight of fear. But somewhere in that camp, there was a young shepherd boy, not a soldier, not a warrior, just a boy who had spent most of his life alone in the fields watching sheep under the open sky. That boy was David. No one noticed him that night. No one expected anything from him. In fact, most of the soldiers probably thought tomorrow would be exactly the same as the last 40 days. Another morning, another roar from the giant, another day of fear. But what they didn't know was that everything was about to change. Because sometimes the greatest battles in history don't begin with armies marching. They begin in silence, somewhere between fear and faith. Imagine being David that night, the stars above the valley, the sound of thousands of soldiers sleeping around you, and somewhere in the darkness, the shadow of a giant who had terrified an entire nation. Tomorrow, the boy would walk onto a battlefield where even trained warriors refused to stand. Tomorrow, the world would watch a shepherd face a giant. But tonight was the quiet moment before history changed forever. And the question is this: what gives a young shepherd the courage to face a giant that terrified an entire army? Because the answer might change the way you see fear, faith, and the battles in your own life. And it all begins the night before David faced Goliath. The valley looked peaceful from a distance. Soft hills rolled across the land, and a thin river cut through the middle of the valley like a silver ribbon under the fading light of the evening sky. But beneath that quiet landscape, tension filled the air. On one side of the valley stood the army of Israel. Thousands of soldiers, rows of tents, fires burning as men prepared their evening meals. Yet something was missing: confidence. Because across that valley, another army waited. The Philistines. Their campfires flickered against the darkening sky, their warriors laughing loudly, as if they already knew how this story would end. And in many ways they did. Because every single day for 40 days, the same thing had happened. At sunrise, a massive figure would step forward from the Philistine camp. Armor made of bronze would reflect the morning light like fire. His spear was as thick as a weaver's beam, and the iron tip alone weighed more than many soldiers' swords. His footsteps alone sounded like thunder across the valley floor. His name was Goliath, a warrior so large that standing near him felt like standing next to a wall. Every morning he would shout across the valley, "Choose one man to fight me." If Israel won, the Philistines would serve them. But if Goliath won, Israel would become their servants. It sounded simple: one fight, one outcome. But the problem was this: no one wanted to fight him. Even the bravest warriors in Israel looked at the giant and felt their courage disappear. Shields suddenly felt too small. Spears suddenly felt too light. And so day after day, the same scene repeated itself. Goliath stepped forward. He shouted his challenge. And the army of Israel stood in silence. Fear had become their routine. But that evening, something unusual had happened. A young shepherd had arrived at the camp. His name was David. He hadn't come as a warrior. He came carrying food: bread, grain, cheese for his brothers who served in the army. His father had simply asked him to check on them and bring back news from the battlefield. Nothing more. David had probably imagined something very different. Maybe he expected to see brave warriors preparing for battle. Maybe he imagined heroic soldiers sharpening their swords, ready to defend their nation. Instead, what he found was an army trapped in fear. Earlier that day, David had stood among the soldiers as the giant stepped forward once again. And when Goliath shouted his challenge across the valley, something strange happened. The soldiers around David stepped backward. Some looked at the ground. Others pretended not to hear. But no one moved forward. David couldn't understand it. This giant wasn't just insulting the army. He was mocking their God. And yet, the entire camp stood frozen. Later that evening, the soldiers whispered about the giant around their campfires. Some talked about the reward the king had promised: riches, honor, even marriage into the royal family. But none of those rewards were enough to overcome their fear. David listened quietly. The firelight flickered across his face as he stared into the flames. Maybe the soldiers saw a giant, but David saw something else. Because David's life had prepared him for moments like this. Long before this battlefield, there had been another place. The wilderness. For years, David had spent his days watching sheep under the open sky. No crowds, no armies, just fields, hills, and silence. But that silence had not been empty. It had been filled with moments of danger. Because protecting sheep in the wilderness was not peaceful work. Predators came often. Lions, bears. And when those predators attacked, David didn't run. He fought. With nothing more than a sling and a shepherd's staff. Most people would see a young shepherd boy. But hidden behind that quiet life was a courage no one in the army knew about. That night in the camp, as the soldiers whispered about the giant, David thought about those moments. The roar of a lion. The sudden attack of a bear. The instinct to protect what had been placed in his care. And every time danger came, he had survived. Not because he was the strongest, but because he trusted something greater than himself. And that was the difference between David and everyone else in that valley. The soldiers saw the size of the giant. David saw the size of God. The moon slowly rose above the valley. The fires burned lower as the soldiers began to sleep. But the tension of the battlefield remained. Because everyone knew what tomorrow would bring. Morning. The giant's footsteps. Another challenge. Another day of fear. But somewhere in that camp, a quiet decision had already begun forming in the heart of a shepherd. A decision that would soon shock an entire army. Because the truth is this. Sometimes the greatest courage in history doesn't come from trained warriors. It comes from someone who refuses to see the battle the same way everyone else does. And by the time the sun rose over the valley again, everything was about to change. Morning came slowly over the valley. A pale orange light crept over the hills as the first rays of sunlight touched the battlefield. The cool air of dawn hung over the camp of Israel, but no one felt peace. Because everyone knew what was coming. They had seen the same scene for 40 days. The same routine. The same fear. And right on time, it began again. From the Philistine camp, a massive shadow moved forward. Heavy armor clanked with every step. The ground almost seemed to shake beneath the weight of the giant's stride. And then the voice came. Deep, loud, mocking. Goliath stepped into the center of the valley once again. His bronze armor flashed in the sunlight. The enormous spear in his hand looked more like a tree branch than a weapon. And with a voice that echoed across the hills, he shouted his challenge. Choose a man to come down and fight me. The words rolled across the battlefield like thunder. All along the lines of Israel's army, soldiers stiffened. Some gripped their shields tighter. Others slowly stepped backward. The same fear returned instantly. But this time, something was different. Among the soldiers stood a young shepherd who refused to step back. David watched the giant carefully. The size, the armor, the spear. Yes, the giant was terrifying. But David noticed something the others didn't. The giant was still just a man. And more importantly, this giant was defying the living God. David turned to the soldiers standing nearby. Who is this Philistine, he asked, that he should defy the armies of the living God? The soldiers looked at him in disbelief. Some laughed nervously. Others shook their heads. Did this boy not understand what was happening? One soldier explained the situation again. Yes, the king had promised a great reward. Yes, whoever defeated the giant would receive riches and honor. But that didn't matter. No one could defeat Goliath. The giant was simply too strong, too experienced, too powerful. But David didn't see the situation the same way. Because David wasn't comparing himself to the giant. He was comparing the giant to God. And in that comparison, the giant suddenly seemed much smaller. As the conversation spread through the camp, word eventually reached the king, King Saul. When Saul heard that a young shepherd was speaking boldly about facing the giant, he ordered that the boy be brought to him. Soon David stood inside the king's tent. The air inside felt heavy with tension. Soldiers stood silently along the walls while Saul studied the young man standing before him. This was not what the king expected. David was young. No armor. No sign of military training. Just a shepherd boy standing in a soldier's camp. Saul finally spoke. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, the king said. You are only a boy, and he has been a warrior since his youth. The words sounded logical, reasonable. Anyone listening would probably agree. But David calmly answered. He began telling the king about his life in the wilderness, about the sheep he protected, about the day a lion attacked the flock, how he chased it down, how he rescued the sheep from its mouth, and when the lion turned on him, David struck it down. Then he told the king about the bear. Another attack, another fight, another impossible moment that somehow ended in victory. The soldiers in the tent listened in silence. These were not the stories of a normal shepherd. And then David said something that changed everything. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from this Philistine. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't pride. It was faith. A deep certainty that the same God who had protected him before would protect him again. King Saul stared at the boy for a long moment. The king had seen many warriors. Men with strength. Men with weapons. Men with experience. But faith like this, that was rare. Finally Saul spoke again. If you are going to fight him, the king said slowly, then at least wear my armor. Servants quickly brought the royal armor. Heavy bronze plates. A helmet. A sword. They dressed David like a soldier. But the moment David tried to walk, something felt wrong. The armor was too heavy, too unfamiliar, too different from the life he had always known. David took a few steps. Then he stopped. He removed the helmet. He loosened the armor. And finally he said something simple. I cannot go in these. The soldiers exchanged confused glances. Who goes into battle without armor? Without a sword? Without protection? But David knew something they didn't. His strength had never come from armor. His courage had never come from weapons. His confidence came from something far greater. So instead of a sword, David picked up his shepherd's staff. Instead of armor, he carried a sling. And before walking toward the battlefield, he knelt beside a small stream in the valley. The water flowed quietly over smooth stones. David reached down and carefully selected 5 smooth stones from the stream. One by one, he placed them into his shepherd's pouch. The soldiers watched in disbelief. This was the champion who would face the giant? A boy, a sling, 5 stones. Across the valley, the Philistine army began to notice movement. A single figure stepping forward from Israel's side. At first they laughed, because the warrior approaching looked nothing like a soldier. No armor, no sword, just a shepherd walking toward the battlefield. But the giant saw him too. Goliath leaned forward slightly. His eyes narrowed, and then a deep laugh rumbled from his chest. This was the opponent Israel had chosen? A boy. The giant's laughter echoed across the valley. But David kept walking, step by step, toward the most feared warrior in the land. Because sometimes the most powerful victories in history begin with something that looks completely impossible. And in that moment, the entire valley held its breath. The valley suddenly felt smaller. Thousands of soldiers stood on both sides of the battlefield, yet in that moment it felt like only 2 people existed. One was a giant, the other a shepherd. Slowly, steadily, David walked down the slope toward the valley floor. His staff rested in one hand. The sling hung loosely at his side, and in the small pouch at his waist, 5 smooth stones waited. Across the valley, the massive figure of Goliath stepped forward to meet him. The giant's armor flashed in the sun like a wall of bronze. Every step he took echoed across the battlefield. Behind him walked his shield-bearer, struggling just to carry the enormous shield that protected the warrior. But when Goliath finally saw the boy clearly, he stopped. And then he laughed. It was a deep, mocking laugh that rolled across the valley like thunder. Am I a dog, the giant shouted, that you come to me with sticks? The Philistine army burst into laughter. Even some soldiers in Israel's camp stared in disbelief. This didn't look like a battle. It looked like a mistake. Goliath leaned forward, towering over the battlefield. Come here, he roared, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. The threat echoed across the valley. For a moment, silence followed. Every soldier waited to see what the boy would do. But David did not step back. Instead, he stepped forward. And then he spoke. His voice was not loud like the giant's, but it carried across the valley with surprising strength. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin. The armies listened carefully now. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. A ripple moved through the soldiers. David continued, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. The giant's smile faded slightly. David lifted his head, his voice growing stronger. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands." The soldiers stared. The shepherd boy was not speaking like someone afraid. He was speaking like someone certain. And then David said something no one expected. "All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves." The wind moved through the valley. The armies stood frozen. For the battle is the Lord's. For a moment, no one moved. Then suddenly the giant roared with anger. Goliath began marching forward. Each step pounded against the ground. His enormous spear lowered slightly as he prepared to crush the boy standing before him. The Philistine army began shouting in excitement. Finally, the giant would end this ridiculous challenge. But something unexpected happened next. Instead of running away, David started running toward the giant. The entire valley erupted in confusion. A shepherd running toward a giant. It made no sense. David's hand reached into his pouch. His fingers wrapped around one smooth stone. Quickly, he placed the stone into his sling. The sling began to spin. Faster and faster. The sound of the spinning sling cut through the air. The giant kept walking forward. Confident. Unstoppable. But he didn't realize something important. A sling in the hands of an experienced shepherd was not a toy. It was a weapon. And David had used it thousands of times in the wilderness. Against predators. Against danger. Against death itself. The sling spun one final time. Then David released the stone. The sound was sharp. A sudden crack through the air. The stone shot forward like lightning. Across the valley. Past the giant's shield. Past his armor. And in a single moment, it struck. The stone slammed directly into the giant's forehead. The impact echoed across the battlefield. For a brief moment, the giant froze. His massive body stood perfectly still. Then slowly, the impossible began to happen. The giant staggered. The giant swayed. And then the most feared warrior in the land fell forward. The ground shook as Goliath crashed face first into the dust of the valley. Silence exploded across the battlefield. No one moved. No one spoke. Thousands of soldiers stared at the giant lying motionless on the ground. The impossible had just happened. A shepherd, a sling, one stone, and the giant who had terrified an entire army was defeated. But David didn't stop. He ran forward quickly, standing over the fallen warrior. He took the giant's own sword and finished the battle. When the Philistine army saw their champion dead, panic spread instantly. Their laughter disappeared. Their confidence vanished. And suddenly the army that once mocked Israel turned and ran. A roar of victory erupted from Israel's camp. The soldiers who had once been frozen by fear now charged down the valley in pursuit. The battlefield that had been silent for 40 days suddenly exploded with shouts of triumph. But in the middle of that chaos stood a young shepherd, breathing heavily, dust covering his face, the sling still hanging loosely in his hand. Moments earlier, he had been just another boy in the camp. Now, the entire nation would remember his name, David, because sometimes the most powerful victories in history don't come from strength. They come from faith strong enough to face a giant when everyone else runs away. Dust still floated slowly through the valley. Moments earlier, the battlefield had been filled with tension, fear, and uncertainty. But now everything had changed. The giant who had terrified an entire army lay motionless on the ground. For 40 days, his voice had echoed across this valley. For 40 days, his challenge had silenced thousands of soldiers. But now, that voice was gone. The impossible had happened. Across the hills, the army of Israel erupted into shouts of victory. Soldiers who had once stepped backward in fear were now running forward with courage, chasing the fleeing Philistine army. What had once been a valley of fear had become a valley of triumph. And at the center of it all stood a young shepherd, David. Just hours earlier, he had arrived at the camp carrying food for his brothers. No armor, no title, no reputation as a warrior. To most people, he was simply a boy from the fields. Yet that same boy had just defeated the most feared warrior in the land. But the real story of this moment was not about a sling. It was not about a stone. And it was not even about a giant. The real story was about faith. Because the difference between David and the entire army was not strength. It was perspective. Every soldier in Israel saw the same giant. They saw his height, his armor, his weapons. They measured the size of the problem standing in front of them. And when they compared themselves to the giant, they felt small. But David saw the situation differently. He did not measure the giant against himself. He measured the giant against God. And in that comparison, the giant suddenly seemed much smaller. This is why the story of David and Goliath has echoed through history for thousands of years. Because every generation faces its own giants. Sometimes those giants look like fear. Sometimes they look like doubt. Sometimes they appear in the form of challenges so overwhelming that they make us feel powerless. Just like the army standing in that valley. Frozen, waiting, hoping someone else would step forward. But the lesson of this story is simple and powerful. Faith changes the way we see our battles. David was not fearless. He simply trusted that the same God who had helped him before would help him again. When a lion attacked his flock, he survived. When a bear threatened his sheep, he survived. And because he had seen God's faithfulness in the past, he believed that the same faithfulness would appear again. That confidence gave him courage when no one else had it. But there is another powerful truth hidden in this moment. Victory often begins long before the battle. David's courage did not suddenly appear on the battlefield. It had been built during quiet moments in the wilderness. Years spent alone protecting sheep. Years spent learning to trust God when no one else was watching. Those hidden seasons prepared him for the moment that would change history. The world saw a boy defeat a giant. But God had been preparing that boy for years. And sometimes the same thing happens in our own lives. The quiet seasons. The difficult moments. The struggles no one else sees. Those moments may feel small. They may feel unimportant. But often those are the very moments where courage is being built. Faith is being strengthened. And preparation is taking place for battles we haven't faced yet. When the people of Israel looked at that battlefield, they thought the story was about a giant. But in reality, it was about something much bigger. It was about what happens when someone trusts God more than they fear the problem in front of them. Because giants may look unstoppable, problems may look overwhelming. But history shows us something powerful. Giants fall, and sometimes the person who defeats them is the one no one expected. A shepherd, a sling, 5 stones, and a faith strong enough to believe that the battle was never his to fight alone. That is the lesson of the valley, and it is why the name of David is still remembered today.